All right, hello. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Everybody, this is Tara Allen. I'll just go ahead and step out of the way and let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tara Allen. I'm originally from Plattsburgh, New York, this really small town in upstate New York. Might as well be a part of Canada. Um, it's true. I'm a recent graduate from the Crane School of Music. I have a bachelor's in music education, and I'm a current offer holder from the University of Sheffield in Sheffield, UK, for a master's of psychology of music. It's pretty cool. Um, I think that's a pretty good background.
Yep. And then you are a friend of Tyler Mazzone, right?
Yes,
Yes. Okay.
absolutely. We went to school together for our
Yeah,
undergrad.
that's cool. Oh, what do you plan on doing with your what specifically do you want to do with your degree?
It's interesting. I originally thought that I wanted to be a music teacher. I'm also a bass clarinetist, but because I have a music ed degree, I play all of the instruments because that's just part of the degree. But
Yeah, that's just
um,
undergraduate. Yep.
yeah, I thought I wanted to be a music teacher, and I was like, no, I don't want to be a part of this system. It doesn't interest me anymore. So I decided to go towards music psychology, and that definitely makes me feel a lot better. So, like, essentially, the end goal is to become a music psychologist, and I would like to be a professor and have a lab at some point, so I
That
can keep
sounds
doing
really neat.
research.
Yep. And what are some of the things that you're wanting to research or researching right now?
Yeah, so currently I'm actually working with a friend. She wants to be an occupational therapist, and we've been kind of like working together about like autism and music therapy and occupational therapy. So we've been doing a lot of combined research together with that. But I want to research things that are like really similar to that, mostly how to make music more accessible in general for the disabled community and how we can incorporate a more inclusive music education into our classroom.
All right. And speaking of that, one I remember you sent me an essay. I can't think of the name of it now that I'm trying to recall it, but you were talking about dyslexia in the classroom.
Yes, so I had done research in my undergrad, which was not a part of my undergrad. I chose and went out of my way to specifically do this thing. It's a bug. Um, I had done a research paper called Music as a Cognitive Skill, Dyslexia and Music,
There
and
it
I had
goes.
presented it at the NAFME conference as a poster, which to me was a big deal, and I really enjoyed doing it because I learned a lot from it. Um, it's really awesome. Some of this research talked about like how dyslexic people perceive music, how sometimes musical notation is actually really hard for them to perceive, especially as it's going really fast. Um, like white paper against black lettering is way too bright for the sensories, and this is the same for a lot of neurodivergent people in general. It's just like the contrast, so they may need different colored pieces of paper. Like for instance, I use gray paper, and it is a send. I love it. Like my eyes. Um,
Yes.
it's really great because it was interesting because I would have never thought of it like that. My dad is dyslexic, and I knew he always had a hard time like trying to learn how to read music because it was too difficult, and it had something to do with the brightness of the paper, the way that music is specifically organized on the paper, like the staff, the extra words, all these different symbols are really confusing because a lot of dyslexic people actually have like sign recognition issues, is what I had read about, and which is why it's so difficult. And I didn't know that. It made sense. It's kind of like why sometimes reading is really hard for them because letters are technically symbols, technically
Yeah.
speaking.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And looking through your CV, you've had quite a few papers that you presented. Well, yeah, I know
Yes.
you've attended quite a few. I know you've done NAFME, and then there was another association that you also got a chance to present for, if I remember correctly, or it might have
I
been something
know.
that you attended.
Yeah, so I did a presentation for the school also because it was a part of the grant that they had given me. And I've also like I'm very active in other things like we have like an international clarinet association and other things.
Yep. Oh, okay. Yep. And when I was digging, when you sent me over everything, I kind of chuckled because I saw the influence. You say you grew up around '90s, 90s grunge, alt rock, and metal. That genre of music. How has that influenced your perspective of music?
Oh, it definitely has. And so, a little bit more background about me is like, I did not grow up with classical music. I didn't even learn about classical music like fully until I went to college. I did have classical experiences in high school, and obviously, I played the bass clarinet, I played in band. I love to play classical music, but growing up in my house, that is not what I listened to. My dad and I kind of just vibed out to things like Slayer and Rammstein and Korn and other things, and that's just, yes, I love classical music, but it wasn't like my actual musical culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It only made up like 2% of that.
Yeah.
um, I grew up listening to a lot of like really grungy, grimy, dark music with the dark guitars, the heavy drums, these certain like dark sounds to voices and things. And I know like even in with commissioning music, I had commissioned a piece that was for bass clarinet and violin. And when I commissioned this piece of music, they're like, what? It was like, oh, that's not an instrumentation I would have ever even thought of. And I think that I'm thankful that I have that background because it makes me more open and susceptible to being like, oh, let's just try this random instrumentation or try these weird noises in this typically classical sound. It's like it doesn't need to sound the same all the time. I want it to sound different or silly or grungy or whatever the world can create.
Yeah, and I think that's really neat because it's the direction that music is starting to go in. And I mean, I think the pandemic also facilitated that because it's difficult to have a full 90-piece orchestra with a virus going around where you have to keep everybody 6 feet apart. So it's really refreshing to even see that you've had this open mentality beforehand because it's not your traditional woodwind quintets or your traditional symphonic bands and stuff like
Yeah.
that. It's really starting to go towards these unique chamber orchestrations and now particularly the flex music.
Flex music.
Yeah, so for when the pandemic started, they
Oh,
it was
yeah.
Brian Balmages, Frank Ticheli, and a few other really strong names in the classical music industry started well, not developing, but reintroducing flex music where you just have parts transposed into different for different instruments, and then you could just make it work with whatever instrumentation you have. And so
Well,
that's
yes. Yeah, it's because the pandemic had made it so hard for us to all well, I mean, it made it easier for us to connect, but it made it harder for us to connect in the way that we aren't physically together to create the music.
right. And I feel like it's done the same thing with music itself. It's made traditional music harder to perform, and it's forced us to be like, oh, okay, let's do these new things. Because I mean, these ensembles have always been out there, but it's never really entered the concert stage. And I think once things start laying up, it's going to make its way there because that's what's been happening the past year and a half is commissions for all these small pieces.
Yeah, and I think that that has to do a lot with how we as classical musicians like to stick within a specific tradition, which in a lot of ways has, I think the pandemic has helped us realize that it's really reaching its limits in some instances. Not saying throw it in the garbage, but more so, oh, we have this thing and it needs to be recreated.
Right. Like it needs to fit the people of now as opposed to the people of, you know, about 800 years ago.
That's a little bit a long time ago
Just a
for
little
us
bit.
now talking on a screen.
Right. Yep. So let's jump into a little bit more about your personal experiences. What uh let's talk about some of your diagnoses, because I know you do have a few disabilities, and just let us know what is, what you have and what it's been like, going through a high school and a college music program with these disabilities.
It was very interesting. Starting between like the first and second year of my life, I had fluid in my ears and I had lost like some hearing. I did get my hearing back, but I had to get like tubes in my ears, and it prolonged my speech and ability to like. I still sometimes struggle with certain oral sounds. I'm like, what's the difference between them sometimes? Um, and I know that point in my life, they didn't know what was going on. So they're like, oh. And then I had to go to preschool like very early so that I could learn how to speak, like to take speech therapies. And then I had to do reading and writing therapies also. I remember like I'd say from like first grade to like fourth-ish grade, I think I did it. I don't remember. It was such a long time ago. I just remember doing it. Um, and they're like, "Oh, your kid has something that's up," in reference to my parents. They're like, "We don't know what it is, but we're not going to send her out for a diagnosis," which is very problematic. And I really struggled at that point in my life because I'm like, why am I struggling with this? No one else is struggling. This doesn't even make any sense to me. Like I felt really bad about it. And then I went into middle school and I started doing better because, well, I had started playing my instrument. I really enjoyed it. So I was starting to do better in school because I felt more comfortable. And then they're like, oh, she doesn't need it. And I go off into high school. I graduate really pretty well into my class, and I get to my freshman year of college and it's just like a hammer just like slams right down. It's like, nope. And I was like, I've always known I have something, but what is it? you know and I had tried to go to the accommodative services and trio at SUNY Potsdam, and they looked me dead in the face and went, we're not helping you unless you pay a $2,000 diagnostic. And I'm like, I'm struggling through school right now. Did you not see my grades? I'm not doing good. And I spent 3 years after that into my junior and even into my senior year of my undergrad arguing with people all of the time about it. I'm like, I'm struggling. I know I'm disabled. I know something is up. I don't know what it is, but I know it's something. And I had a lot of professors go, no, you're over exaggerating. No, you can just do it like everybody else. No, you're fine. No, that's an excuse. And then finally, October 2020, which isn't even that long ago when you think about it, I was finally diagnosed. And they're like, you have combined type ADHD. You might also have dyslexia. You might also be autistic. We don't know, but you definitely have this thing. And I was like, oh. And after my diagnosis, I spent a lot of time learning about ADHD and like what it is. And I was like, I thought ADHD was, oh, I just can't focus. No, it's really not. It is way more than that.
Well,
And
why don't you take a second and talk a little bit more about it, just for people who may not be fully
yeah.
aware?
So ADHD, I'm going to call it a disorder. I know some people don't like calling it that, but I think not calling it a disorder or a disability, you are diminishing and erasing those people's experiences with it. Um, ADHD can be really complex. You can be inattentive, you can be combined type, or you can be I'm blanking right now. It's the ADHD memory. um,
Take your
or
time.
hyperactive. It's hyperactive. A lot of the times, typically, I just say that I'm ADHD because usually ADHDers experience all of the symptoms, and sometimes when you get tested, you just experience a little bit more symptoms than the other type. I'm gonna put it in quotes because most people just go ADHD. Um,
Yeah.
but essentially, it's like our brains sometimes really, really can't focus, but it's also another thing. I literally don't perceive time. I just don't. I could sit there for hours and not realize that time has passed. Like every single day, just like, oh, it's 6 o'clock now, and I woke up at 8 o'clock in the morning. What happened? It's like someone says, "Oh, see you in 5 minutes." I'm like, "Oh, see you in 5 minutes," and like it's like 40 minutes later, and I didn't realize 5 minutes happened. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
um, it's also like sometimes you have like really bad emotional dysregulation because of it, because your brain is kind of like how you can't regulate focus. Your brain also sometimes has a hard time regulating feelings, which is why a lot of ADHD people sometimes will have like what they call outbursts sometimes. Like they'll get really sad sometimes. And you're like, why are you sad? And I'm like, I don't know. It just
Yeah.
happens. It's also why a lot of the times, especially women with ADHD, get diagnosed with depression or anxiety because it masks in that way, but it's not at all. It's not that thing. And it's also like this thing that we call executive dysfunction, meaning that like I could sit there and look at the thing that I have to do and go, I don't want to do that, and I just won't do it. I'll find literally anything else to not do it, and it'll take me 4 days to do one task. It is horrendous sometimes. Like, I need to do this thing. My professor's like, you need to do this thing, and I'm like, like,
And
oh
it is
no.
so is it like you understand the urgency, but you just can't get yourself to do it?
Yes, it's because again, I also don't feel time passing. So how can I know when someone tells me a due date? I'm like, what does that mean? You know, I'm like, oh yeah, other people actually perceive that happening. I don't. So it's going to take me 4 days to do this one thing you told me that was due 4 days ago.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but
No, that makes perfect sense. And then you also said something I wanted to talk a little bit more about. You said before that with women, they generally ADHD, when you're diagnosed with ADHD, it also comes generally with depression or anxiety. And you said it's kind of like a masking thing. Uh, what exactly is masking?
So masking is well, it's more than just the ADHD community, but masking essentially is like ADHD, autistic, dyslexic, just neurodivergent people in general. It's a thing that we do in order to mask like what our emotions are and the ways that we're feeling and the ways that we think and speak. So I actually, after my diagnosis, I didn't even realize I was doing it. It was essentially, I was like, oh, this isn't me. This isn't the facial expression I would actually make. I was like, oh. And essentially, neurodivergent people mask in order to fit in with the neurotypical people that they are around so that those people are comfortable with them, because we typically would not make an expression like that or talk like that or move our bodies like that.
Got you. And how has masking affected you personally?
I can say that masking made me very tired. I would come home at the end of the day and I would just want to sit in the dark, and I would just get really, really low moods and get really like sad and upset. And I would just go to sleep. I would sleep from like 7 o'clock at night until like the next morning. And after I stop masking, I have all of this energy. I'm very awake. I'm like way more happier, and I don't feel like my sleep schedule now might be wonky and I stay up until like 2 a.m. But that energy that I have now was used towards masking my facial expressions, and it made me just so mentally and physically exhausted from doing it that it's better for me to stay up until 2 a.m. with my brain not being able to shut off than having to mask and be tired every day.
Understandable. Yeah. And another thing that we talked about, and I wish would have asked this a little bit earlier, when we were talking, you were talking about your just kind of like the community you were in, where you were kind of like You describe it as a little bit more of a conservative and traditional, un. I don't want to say conservative, more of like unaware environment.
Yes. I grew up in somewhere that was moderately conservative. Um, like the retrospects for women and gender and people and things. I know a lot more of the people my age are definitely a lot more liberal here, but even then, there's still a very high conservative population, and a lot of those views that I grew up around. I think to myself, if I didn't grow up with the parents that I did, how would my views be? I think they'd be very conservative if I did. Sadly, it's like the retrospect of that we're in a small town and because you're from here you stay here and you're local, or that you need to be like an at-home mom and these other things. That's just complete opposite of who I am. So
And it sounds like your parents kind of pushed you to just kind of break that mold and do whatever you find is best for
yeah,
you.
yeah, I think especially like out of like especially my mother in this retrospect, it was always don't really listen to what some people in this community say, just do it.
Yeah, it's glad it. I'm glad that you had that
Live your
support.
life.
Yes, I'm glad that you have that support because I know, especially with the community thing, this isn't even a conservative or liberal thing. Just wherever you are, there's just a natural pressure to kind of fit into whatever mold is already there. So it's good to know that you had somebody pushing you to be you and not be the mold.
Yes, I'm very happy about it.
Yeah. And just with all of your experiences between, your hometown environment, high school experiences and college experiences, what would you recommend? How can we make, I'm going to say how can we make things more accessible or be more welcoming, but also how do we make music specifically more accessible and welcoming just based on your experiences?
Yeah, so based off of my experiences, I can say that in a lot of ways, not only was my diagnosis really inaccessible, and this is really common for a lot of people, it's inaccessible and it's inexpensive. So definitely one of the first steps would be is making a diagnostic accessible. A lot of people actually have to self-diagnose themselves because it's not accessible and it's really not okay. Shouldn't have to do that and suffer through that.
Right.
Um, and then there's also like, this is a really big one, and I know teachers probably don't want to hear this, but stop punishing children for having neurodivergent traits. It's not okay. This is really common. I even noticed it when I was student teaching in the elementary school. Like behavioral charts, making these children, like if they have to move around, yelling at them, even if they're neurodivergent or not, this is how these children learn. They have to be up and moving, they have to be singing and dancing. That's just how they learn.
Right.
And it was so interesting seeing that and I'm going, you're punishing that kid for having neurodivergent traits, and they're probably neurodivergent, but they can't even be diagnosed because it's inaccessible, you know? And it's very interesting. I think that that's another thing too, is thinking about how we teach our children when they're in elementary school, thinking about how we're talking to our children in sense of like behavior and like moving around, outburst and other things. Like there are definitely different ways of dealing with those types of things. From the things that I've seen, it's like the teacher basically yells at the kid and moves them up on a map, and I'm like, that's not solving the problem. It's like that kid, just like anybody else, is a person and needs someone to come up to them and be, hey, I noticed that you're acting a little out of normal than you normally do. Are you okay? What's going on? You know? It's way better than yelling at the kid for the behavior, because it's like the behavior is happening for a reason. I know that I had behaviors when I was that age, and it was because I was undiagnosed with ADHD and that emotional dysregulation. I didn't understand my feelings, even less so than other kids. Like, it's
Yeah.
like you just got to take those extra steps to recognize that they're a human being and take that energy to be like, okay, Why is this happening? I think that that's something I think that we can definitely work towards, and I think is really important. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, no, no. That makes perfect sense. What about at the college level?
At the at the college, I'm sorry.
I felt it. I felt it as soon as I heard the sigh.
Oh boy. At the college level, I think that we need to realize, and this is something that I'll even say, because I also want to be a professor. Just because we have a doctorate doesn't mean we're done learning. Just because you have a singular seminar in how to work with disabled people doesn't mean you know what you're doing. It doesn't. It really, really doesn't. And taking the extra time to, like, especially in the lenses of the disabled and someone who's disabled myself, taking the time to be like, what I just thought about that student was ableist. I should listen to them because they know their own experiences. And that's not something that really happens very often. And I noticed it didn't really happen very often throughout my degree, which is very disappointing for me to say. Having a professor tell me when I go, I think I'm dyslexic. This is why I did bad on this exam. I didn't understand half of this reading. Look at me and go, you should just learn and read the content backwards is an appropriate response to a student struggling.
Which I've never even heard that one before. I mean, I've heard a lot of not understanding or not being ignorant of, accommodating people, but I've never heard that.
I've heard some interesting things throughout my undergrad, and none of them were okay. And it's like, I think learning how to talk and how to accommodate an understanding of ADA law is a really big one, because legally they can't deny you your accommodations anyway. So it's interesting. So when those arguments happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm like, we technically really shouldn't be arguing about this right now.
Right.
But it's like, I think that that's something really big that should change, especially as we're heading in a direction in a lot of instances where we're starting to listen to groups of people that normally are not very heard. And I think that it's important that professors take the extra time, especially at the college level and schools, take the extra time to be like, okay, there's this thing going on and it needs to be fixed, clearly in reference to the disabled community. Like, this isn't okay. And I think having actual disabled people having these conversations with like accommodative services and other things are important also, because it's like, you can be a researcher and not be disabled and kind of know how to help disabled people, but if you don't have the thing, then you don't truly know if you don't have the thing or you don't experience that thing.
Right. Yep. And then this actually leads right into the last thing I wanted to talk about is your podcast. Now, so when I was looking in, doing my research on you, I ran into your podcast, and I just have to say this, if you want a really helpful resource to understanding, and, if you, as a fully functioning person, if you want insight to just an idea of what, different disabilities are like, you need to listen to Tara's podcast. It has been an absolutely amazing resource. I'm actually about to become a band teacher and a math teacher, and this has absolutely just stopped me in my tracks and just, really made me think of, like, how do I make my classroom more approachable? Because being able to get an inside experience, to have an insider talk about what's going on, it's really changed my perspective of it, and really is giving me I feel like I'm more equipped, because because there's this the theme of, talk to them, see what's going on, see what you can do to accommodate them. But let me stop talking before I keep rambling on. Tell us the name of your podcast and what you're doing with it.
Yeah, of course. So I started a podcast almost a year ago now, actually. It's called Breaking the Third Wall in Music, and I call it that because I want it to be like, we're breaking this wall. We're done with it. Goodbye. um, but the podcast essentially invites disabled people of all different kinds throughout the music scene, whether it's you're a composer, you're a music producer, you do it as a hobby, you enjoy just doing music in general, you're a performer, music therapist, whatever it could be. Um, and you're a disabled musician, and that's how you identify. And essentially I invite people on to share their stories and their experiences, and it also helps people who are listening not only learn more about that person's disability, because in a lot of instances we don't know a lot about lots of different disabilities, and less so than we think we do. Um, and I invite these people on to share their experiences with being disabled, what it's like having that disability, how it's changed their individual perspective on life, and how, even in some instances, how it approaches that they participate in music and how they do music, and so many other different things, whether it's assistive technologies that they have to use, maybe they have to leave out blurbs of music because their hands can't physically do the thing, or they compose in a specific way because they can't do it the traditional way, or so many different things. And I definitely can say it's been really interesting hearing a lot of different perspectives. I've had people who are neurodivergent, I've had people who are physically disabled, and it's interesting hearing everyone else's individual perspectives. And in a lot of instances, there are a lot of people on there like, yep, I have really faced ableism in the music scene because people only want to stick to the traditional way, and I don't want to. And I think that that's one of the best parts about the podcast, I think, is hearing those new perspectives and the new ways that they are individually participating in music and how they're changing that for themselves and maybe other people around them because they're disabled and because of their experiences.
Right. And I believe it's your episode with Keely Dunn. She made she is quite a personality. I
She's
really enjoyed
awesome.
listening. Yes. I really enjoyed listening to that interview. But she made a point about how she talked about how it's weird how ableism kind of creeped its way into classical music when a lot of the staple, most of the composers and performers that really were the foundation of classical music and traditional theory as we notice that as we know it, most of them face some type of neurodivergent traits, or if not a full disability. And
Yep.
so it's interesting how that ableism has kind of crept into the music model when it never
Well,
really
it's actually
belonged in the first
interesting
place.
because like a lot of our like operas and stuff actually portray ableism, but a lot of people just don't notice it. Like there's a lot of operas that I actually talked about this in the last episode of my podcast. So if you want to hear more about it, go listen to that. But it's like I had taken a course called Music and Disability Studies, and it was one of the best courses I ever took. Thank you, Dr. Brooks. It was amazing. Not to plug, but we talked a lot about how like sexism tied in opera, and how like we were portrayed as having only the only people who are allowed to have mood disorders in opera music, and how black and brown individuals are always portrayed as being physically disabled in order to make us as different groups of people that aren't this typical person as like, oh, we're deformed and horrible. And it's really interesting because people don't realize that until they take a class like that, or they don't realize like, oh, disability has been here the whole time. It's just it was being portrayed very differently.
Right. And that I definitely want to do more research because I actually didn't even know about opera. I knew about the sexism in opera, but I mean,
It's
I,
really bad. We had learned about an opera. I don't remember what opera it was, but there was one that we were talking about and we were watching it, and it was clearly this is how they did it, but he was portrayed in blackface, and he was coming onto the stage and he was clearly like pretending to be physically disabled, and it was like really bad. In general, it was really bad. I was like, I didn't even notice that before. Oh,
Yeah, it's definitely something I definitely want to go back and look at a couple of operas and just kind of notice that because I mean I hate to say I'm not surprised by it, but I mean it's just I never noticed it,
yeah,
and thinking back and it's something that I want to go back and watch a few operas and just see it for myself as well.
yeah.
And
Ever have time to
unfortunately,
take a class like that? I recommend it.
yeah,
Because
definitely
it
those
ties like
oddball classes.
all of it in together, which was awesome. I was like, oh, that's not cute.
Yeah,
Like,
it's really those odd classes that really give you the most insight, and that's the
yeah,
cool part.
yeah, it was a good class.
Yep. And unfortunately, I won't be able to get to that episode for a while because I'm trying to go in order, and I'm about halfway. I
And you
was
have a lot of them.
Yeah, I went out to West Virginia to work a couple band camps and came back, and so that's what I used on my trip to West Virginia and my trip back to Maryland. So definitely, I'm about halfway through, so I'm going to try and get to it soon because that's very
Soon.
interesting to me.
Yeah.
But no, seriously though, if you are looking for a resource to uh, understand more about disabilities and to gain more insight into that perspective, this is the podcast you need to listen to. I can't stress that enough. And if I don't stop myself, I will continue the ramble. But this is seriously just such a it's a resource I didn't know that I needed. It's seriously amazing. Yep. So I think the last thing I have for you is just a little bit of questions, just to get to know you as a person, a little bit more. What is an interesting hobby nobody would expect you to have?
So I've done tarot for a very long time.
Hmm.
A lot of people don't expect that when they meet me. They're like, oh. They're like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even expecting that either. It's a very interesting thing. How did you even get started with that?
So I started when I was really young, and I ended up finding out when I was an adult that some of my family also does, and I was like, oh, so it's just a family thing. That's
Oh,
cool.
wow. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it happens sometimes.
All right. What about a piece or a song that everybody should listen to?
Of course, I'm going to recommend a symphonic metal song. I love symphonic metal music. Epica is my favorite band, so I have to recommend a song by her. I'd have to say Design Your Universe, Part 6 by Epica. It's such a good, I don't know whether to call it a song or a piece because it has so many classical aspects, but also it just breaks out into metal.
Oh my goodness, I'm definitely going to listen to that after this. Oh goodness. What about a book everyone should read?
Oh, Music and Miracles by Don Campbell. It is such a good book. It talks about how like many different types of people, whether they're doctors, psychologists, midwives, all different kinds of people use music as an aspect of life to help heal and make even help people die and pass on. I think that one of my favorite things inside of the book was this neuroscientist from Japan, and he was talking about music and its functionality like in the body, and he's like, well, technically every disease and everything in your body has a song. And I was like, I didn't think of it like that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. When I was at George Mason doing my master's, I was studying under Professor Camphouse, but we also had Dr. Glenn Smith, and his specialty is actually in music and the body. And it's
Oh, so
I
cool.
I wish I would have taken the class with him because it he's an interesting character, and it kind of threw me for a loop. So when I saw his name, I was like, okay, let me think twice about doing this. And then I needed to make sure I graduated on time. So I was like, I
You're
pushed
like,
it
I get
back, and that was probably one of my biggest regrets because he had an open class one day, and I just attended, and the amount of synergy music has with the body it's incredible.
it's amazing. It's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I never imagined how deep it went. but it's there's such a natural process for, within our process within nature and math, which I think is still just kind of blowing my mind still after exploring that side of music for about 2 or 3 years. It still just constantly blows my mind.
It's pretty cool. It's pretty nifty.
Yeah. All right. A quote everyone should hear.
I think, I mean, this quote has kind of followed me my entire life. I remember my dad telling it to me every single time I'd cry over probably something that was so small. Um, he'd always go, well, Tara, you can't really see the sun if you don't see the rain first. And I think that that's something that's
Mm,
always followed me throughout my life, was that quote.
that's powerful right there.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to put that on right behind my monitor. You can't see it because you're seeing the other side, but behind my monitor, I actually have a wall that I take sticky notes and I put quotes on it. And whenever I'm just having a bad day, I'll just take a couple of them off and I'll just kind of reaffirm myself and reassure myself. And that's definitely going up there. Yep. And then the last question I have for you is, what is some advice that you have that you would like to share with everybody? Just now, it doesn't have to be specifically about music or disabilities or anything. Just any life advice that you have.
I think my biggest advice, I know it's going to sound so corny, but it's always be yourself. It's probably the corny. It's so corny, like why? But to me, it's really important because I spent a lot of my life not being able to be myself and express myself in a very specific way. And I think not fitting yourself into a box because you feel like you have to be someone else for somebody else when you really don't. The time that you'll be successful is when you are yourself, because then you'll find what you love out of life and you'll just glow right up. It's worth it.
Yes. Thank you so much for doing this interview. I appreciate you so much. Yeah,
Of
this has
course,
been
thank
an
you for
eye-opening
having me.
conversation. And once again, I'm going to continue to plug this. Please go listen to Breaking the Third Wall in music, whether you are a musician or wanting to, pursue music professionally or not. Please check out this podcast. It is such an eye-opening experience. I promise you, if you want to understand, this is a wonderful place to start. Yep.
Thank
Yep.
you, and I hope people will listen because I want more people to know other people's experiences.
Yes, I'm definitely planning on when I put this up on YouTube, I'll make sure I put this in the show notes down at the bottom. But thank you so much, and you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.